A century and a half ago, an entire subcontinent lay under British rule. India. There, 8,000 miles from London, some 250 million people owed allegiance to the British Crown. India was more than the jewel in that crown. It was the rock on which the whole British Empire was built, because from here, Britain could control an entire hemisphere. It's no wonder that the greatest monuments of the British Empire were built in India. Calcutta is still dominated by the British answer to the Taj Mahal, an edifice designed to overawe a subject people, the Victoria Memorial.
The memorial is just a tiny white island in the sea of Bengalis who inhabit this huge city. The amazing thing, when you come to think of it, is that just a few thousand Britons were able to rule not just Bengal, but the whole of India for the greater part of 2 centuries.
Such monuments expressed total imperial self-confidence, but they concealed the insecurities that haunted the tiny population of Britons in India. The surprising thing isn't that British rule eventually ended, but that it lasted as long as it did.
With all its marble grandeur, the Raj was the conundrum at the heart of the British Empire. How on earth did the Victorians do it?
At the apex of the British Empire was Victoria, the great white queen on whose dominions the sun never set. And here at Osborne on the Isle of Wight was one of her favourite country retreats. Osborne harks back to an earlier era, but behind the traditional facade lay the high-tech key to Victoria's global rule. The Renaissance-style art and architecture were deceptive.
Victoria and Albert were never entirely backward-looking. This fresco at Osborne doesn't look exactly modern, but if you look closely, you can see that Britannia, receiving the crown of the sea from King Neptune, is attended by industry, commerce, and navigation. The royal couple understood full well the link between Britain's economic and naval mastery and her imperial power.
From Osborne, the Queen could look across the Solent to Portsmouth, then the world's biggest naval base. Nothing better symbolized the technical lead Britain had established at sea than HMS Warrior. She was protected by 5 inches of modern armor plate and armed with the latest breech-loading guns. Below decks, her huge engines harnessed together the strength of steel and steam. Ships like these put the Royal Navy in a league of its own. At no other time in history has one power so completely dominated the world's oceans. Small wonder Queen Victoria felt secure by the seaside. In her writing room at Osborne, the Queen attended assiduously to her correspondence. But as she sat at her elegant writing desk, she didn't need to rely solely on paper, pen and post to keep in touch with her far-flung empire. Because in her lifetime, a new invention revolutionized global communications.
Telegrams coming in from India. Had a long talk with Lord Beaconsfield after tea about India and Afghanistan, and the necessity for our becoming masters of the country and holding it. Urged strongly on the government to do all in their power to uphold the safety and honour of the empire.
By the 1870s, telegrams could be sent from here to India in a matter of hours. It illustrates perfectly how the world changed during Queen Victoria's long reign. It shrank, and it did so mainly because of British technology.
The global communications revolution emanating from Britain's high-tech economy made this the age of imperial rapid reaction. The telegraph, the railway line and the steamship together were the iron network that simultaneously shrank the world and made Britain's control over it complete. This was what one Victorian memorably called the annihilation of distance.
It was crucial that technology could annihilate distance when Britain's principal source of military power lay on the other side of the world. The Indian Army numbered 180,000 men. As one politician put it,
India is an English barrack in the Oriental Seas, from which we may draw any number of troops without paying for them.
The Indian Army was also dependent on technology, not least the developing science of cartography. Knowledge is power, and knowing where things are is the most basic knowledge a government requires. As important as the telegraph in the technology of domination was the theodolite. So from the 1770s onwards, the British had made huge efforts to make accurate maps of India. From south to north, the Survey of India created the first definitive atlas of the subcontinent, a vast compendium of geographical information immaculately set out on a scale of 4 miles to the inch. But as it climbed northwards into the Himalayas, the survey took on a new significance. Where, after all, did British India actually end? On the other side of India's northwestern mountains lay another European empire with similar aspirations: Russia. Across the Himalayas, Britain and Russia conducted the world's first Cold War. But the spies in this Cold War were surveyors. The Great Survey of India became inextricably bound up with espionage, the great game, as they called it. At times it really did seem like a game. British agents ventured disguised into uncharted territory, measuring distances with the aid of worry beads. These were the original James Bonds, equipped with all the gadgets and ciphers the Victorian equivalent of Q could dream up. If new territory could be mapped, it could be labelled. And if it was labelled, it could be owned. And the northwest frontier wasn't the furthest extremity of British India. Thanks to modern technology, the Raj could reach right across the Indian Ocean. In 1866, the British Empire faced a hostage crisis. A group of British subjects were imprisoned by the Emperor Theodore of Abyssinia, who felt Queen Victoria hadn't given him the respect he deserved. Defiantly, he marched the hostages in chains to his mountain fortress at Magdala, in modern-day Ethiopia.
Nobody messed with Queen Victoria's subjects like that and got away with it. Something had to be done, and fast. And that meant it was time to send for the British Empire's Rapid Reaction Force.
All that was needed to mobilize the Indian Army was a telegram from Whitehall. And within just a few months, a fleet of 280 ships set sail from Bombay with an army of 13,000 men. The expedition perfectly combined Indian muscle with British technology. In command was Lieutenant General Sir Robert Napier, a military engineer of genius. Slowly but inexorably, Napier marched his men across the desert to Magdala. In just 2 hours, the British force annihilated Theodore's army and torched the fortress. Not one of Napier's men was killed, and the hostages were freed. It was a classic mid-Victorian surgical strike. or as they said at the time, butcher and bolt.
The fact that Indian troops could be deployed as far afield as Ethiopia, and with such success, spoke volumes for the way India had changed since the 1857 mutiny.
Here in Lucknow, the expatriate community had endured a grueling siege in which 2,000 of them had died. But the British were determined to learn from the bitter experience of the mutiny. In its aftermath, security became the paramount concern. India was about to enter the age of modern town planning. To retake Lucknow, the avenging British troops had needed to fight their way into the city through a maze of alleyways. For the military engineer accompanying the troops, this was an experience not to be repeated. The engineer's name was Robert Napier, the very same man who led the British to victory so ruthlessly at Magdala. And his approach to the Lucknow problem was in much the same vein.
By the time Napier had finished, he'd managed to demolish 2/5 of the old city and added insult to injury by turning the principal mosque into a temporary barracks. And it was all paid for by the inhabitants, who weren't allowed back in until they'd coughed up.
All suburbs and cover, which would interrupt the free movement of troops, must be swept away, so that troops may move rapidly in any direction.
The broad boulevards Napier built ensured that British troops would have a clear field of fire in the event of native unrest. Even the railway station was redesigned with social order in mind. Its long platforms were perfect for disembarking reinforcements, should they be needed. It was part station, part stronghold.
The way Napier re-engineered Lucknow illustrates one of the basic and inescapable facts about British rule in India. Its foundation was military force. The army here wasn't just an imperial strategic reserve, it was also the guarantor of internal stability in Britain's Asian arsenal.
Yet British India wasn't ruled solely by the mailed fist. It also had its mandarins. And it was the daily grind of administering India that would test the British to breaking point. Across the Indian subcontinent, in a vast network of local districts, British civil servants did what the Victorians did best. They ruled. But they had to do so in conditions Britons simply weren't designed for.
At around this time of year, towards the end of March, the Indian plains become oppressively, intolerably hot. It's 45 degrees in the shade, and what's more, it's going to stay like that right through the monsoon rains until late September. Before the advent of air conditioning, India in the summer was a house of torment for Europeans. Just imagine being locked in a sauna for 6 months, and you have some idea of what it was like.
All summer, the British yearned to escape from the enervating heat of the plains. The answer to their prayers turned out to lie in the foothills of the Himalayas, where the midsummer weather offered a passable imitation of the climate back in the old country.
There were quite a few of these lofty refuges for sun-scorched Britons, but the hill station I'm going to now was in a league of its own. I'm taking the very same train that was taken by countless British administrators and soldiers, not to mention their wives and sweethearts. Some of them came up here on leave, to promenade, party and pair off. But most came here to work, for the simple reason that for half of every year, this little village was the seat of government for the whole of India.
This is Simla. once the summer capital of the Raj, is 7,000 feet above sea level and more than 1,000 miles away from the official capital in Calcutta. Perhaps it was the altitude, but something seemed to come over the British when they escaped up here.
Here begins the story where every right-minded story should begin. That is to say, at Simla, where all things begin and many come to an evil end.
Rudyard Kipling, then a journalist on the Civil and Military Gazette, understood this strange little hybrid world better than anyone.
There are garden parties and tennis parties and picnics and luncheons and dinners and balls, besides rides and walks, which are matters of private arrangement.
And most enticing of all, for Kipling as for others, was the presence all summer long of the wives of officials still working in the plains. Many came to Simla to escape not just their spouses, but India itself. Not Kipling. He was forever ducking and weaving through the native quarter, bantering with Hindu shopkeepers and Muslim horse traders in search of good copy. This was the real India, and Kipling found it intoxicating.
The heat and smells of oil and spices and puffs of temple incense and sweat and darkness and dirt and lust and cruelty, and above all, things wonderful and fascinating innumerable.
At night, Kipling even took to visiting opium dens. He thought the drug an excellent thing in itself. Indeed it was, as the opium monopoly was one of the Indian government's main sources of revenue. Kipling loved the teeming anthill of Indian life, and it troubled him that the Viceroy and his advisers should choose to spend half the year indulging in amateur dramatics in the splendid isolation of Simla.
Kipling's sympathies were always with those of his countrymen who stuck it out down in the plains. Above all, the district officers of the Indian Civil Service, sweltering in their sun-baked outposts. They may have been cynical, seedy and dry, as Kipling himself once said. They may have been betrayed by their wicked wives up in the hills. But the men on the plains for Kipling were the real heroes. It was they who held the Raj together.
The Indian Civil Service was tiny. There were seldom more than 1,000 British officials, ruling a population which by the end of British rule exceeded 400 million. Was this the most efficient bureaucracy in history? Only, Kipling concluded, if the masters of India worked like slaves.
They die or kill themselves by overwork, or are worried to death or brokered in health and hope, in order that the land may be protected from death and sickness, famine and war.
The way Kipling described it, the Indian Civil Service doesn't sound a particularly attractive career option. And yet competition for places was fierce, so fierce that selection had to be based on one of the toughest exams in history. Here are some of the questions that 18-year-olds had to tackle back in 1859. Let's start with logic and mental philosophy.
Question 1. State and illustrate the nature of definition. Or how about this? Classify fallacies. Well, I can't do either of those, so I'll try mental and moral philosophy.
Specify as far as you are able the particular duties coming under the general head of justice. Well, things had certainly changed since the days of Warren Hastings, when jobs with the East India Company were bought and sold as part of a system of aristocratic patronage. The Victorians had loftier aspirations. They wanted India to be ruled by the ultimate academic elite, impartial, incorruptible, and omniscient.
The young men who opted for the rigours of the subcontinent tended to be those whose prospects at home were modest. The bright young sons of provincial professionals who were willing to cram for the sake of a prestigious job overseas. men like Devon-born Evan McConaughey. McConaughey's great-uncle and elder brother had both been Indian civil servants. In 1887, after 2 years of cramming, he passed the ICS entrance exam and set off for Bengal. McConaughey found his new life surprisingly enjoyable.
Imagine then the young assistant setting forth on horseback on a crisp November morning after a good monsoon. He has few cares, his heart is light, and it must be a dull soul that does not respond to the vision. On the way, there will be villages to inspect. Perhaps, if time permits, a quiet shoot.
But the lot of an expatriate mandarin wasn't entirely happy. There was the tedium of hearing appeals against tax assessments and the loneliness of being the only white man for hundreds of miles.
When I first started out, none of my office staff spoke English, and I rarely met another district officer. For 7 months, I scarcely spoke English, and was thrown very much on my own resources.
One white man and his resources ruling an alien multitude. That was the story in districts all over India. Yet reading between the lines of a memoir like McConaughey's, you begin to notice a crucial reality. Everything he and the other district officers did was dependent on another, much larger tier of bureaucracy below them. The heaven-born, as they liked to call themselves, would have been impotent without an auxiliary force of civil servants who were actually Indians.
That was the unspoken truth about British India. It wasn't, as McConaughey himself acknowledged, a conquered country, or at least it didn't feel like one to him. It was only the Indian rulers who'd been supplanted or subjugated by the British. The Indian landowners and merchants carried on much as they had before. Indeed, for many of them, British rule was an opportunity for self-advancement. But the real key to the emergence of a pro-British Indian elite was education, at places like this.
As early as 1817, a Hindu college had been founded in Calcutta by prosperous Bengalis eager for Western education. But in 1835, the creation of a new class of British-educated Indians became government policy. The man responsible was the historian, Liberal politician, and Indian administrator Thomas Babington Macaulay. For Macaulay, what the empire needed were people
who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and colour, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect.
By the 1870s, Macaulay's vision had been in large measure realised. There were 200,000 Indian students in English-speaking secondary schools. One of them was a bright young Bengali named Janakinath Bose. Educated in Calcutta, Bose was called to the bar in 1885, and by the end of his career had been appointed to the Bengal Legislative Council. Bose's ascent brought him considerable wealth, enough to buy this mansion in the fashionable district of Calcutta. It also brought him honours from the British, the title of Rai Bahadur, an Indian knighthood. The truth was that imperial rule depended on securing such local collaboration.
Now, it was easy enough in colonies like Canada or Australia, where white settlers were in a clear majority, but in India they were a tiny minority. Somehow or rather, the Indians had to be involved in their own government, but that was the one thing the white settlers here simply couldn't swallow.
London liberals like Macaulay saw no alternative but to co-opt an elite of anglicised natives. But the men on the spot preferred to keep the natives down. To them, the products of the Bengali colleges were insufferable jumped-up baboos. To co-opt or to coerce? That was the great imperial dilemma. And on its horns, not just India, but colonies as far away as Jamaica were to be impaled. The Caribbean had once been the centre of the most extreme form of racial coercion. Slavery But abolition had done little to improve the lot of the average black Jamaican. Power and wealth remained firmly in the hands of the white planters.
I heard a voice saying, "Tell the sons and daughters of Africa that a great deliverance will take place for them from the hand of oppression. For said the voice, they are oppressed by government, by magistrates, by proprietors, by merchants."
In the 1860s, a wave of religious fervour swept across the island. The talk was of a day of judgment, when divine retribution would be meted out. In Morant Bay, a Baptist deacon named Paul Bogle issued a call to arms.
Blow your shells, roll your drums. War is at hand from today to tomorrow.
The police tried to arrest Bogle. That was the cue for bloody fighting in the streets.
The governor of Jamaica, Edward Eyre, knew exactly what to do. He proclaimed martial law. Within a month, 400 people had been executed, 600 flogged, and 1,000 homes had been razed to the ground. But the white planters who cheered Eyre on as he smashed the rebellion were in for a shock. People in London were outraged by the crackdown, and that included the government.
Eyre was recalled to London and hauled before a royal commission for the indiscriminate way he'd strung up not just Bogle, but a wholly innocent pillar of the black community named George William Gordon, a landowner, a former magistrate, in short, a West Indian baboo. London's liberal intelligentsia were appalled by the execution of a man who was like them in everything except the colour of his skin. The Morant Bay affair exposed a fundamental tension within the British Empire.
Here in Whitehall, liberal ideas were in the ascendant, and that meant the rule of law came first, regardless of skin colour. But British colonists, the men and women out there on the spot, increasingly regarded themselves not just as legally, but as biologically superior to other races. Sooner or later, these two visions, the liberalism of the centre and the racism of the periphery, were bound to collide again.
Race was becoming an issue in all the British colonies, in India as much as in Jamaica. And no one took the issue more seriously than the expatriate business community. Victorian India was booming on a wave of British investment. Cawnpore, on the banks of the River Ganges, was a thriving centre of cotton and wool manufacturing, the Manchester of the East. The Industrial Revolution had been brought here by Hugh Maxwell, whose family had been settled in Cawnpore for 3 generations. Maxwell was one of those hard-faced Scotsmen who were doing well out of the empire. He saw the world, literally, in terms of black and white.
There was a profound difference between the attitudes of the official class and those of the business community. Men like Maxwell felt threatened by the rise of an educated Indian elite, not least because it implied that they themselves might be dispensable. After all, why shouldn't an educated Indian be every bit as good at managing a textile mill as a member of the Maxwell dynasty?
All over India, there had been a creeping segregation. Towns like Cawnpore were cut in two, the neat bungalows of the white community on one side, Blacktown on the other. Liberals in London might look forward to a future of Indian participation in government. Here, the expatriates used the language of the American South to disparage the natives as niggers, and they expected the law to uphold their superiority. But this Asian version of apartheid was about to be challenged by a mild-mannered liberal lawyer from Oxford. Courtney Peregrine Ilbert had never visited India until he was appointed law member of the Viceroy's Council. But no sooner had he set eyes on Calcutta's High Court than Ilbert began to meddle in matters old India hands like Hugh Maxwell took very seriously indeed. Although Indians could be members of the civil service, Up until 1883, Indian magistrates weren't allowed to conduct criminal trials of white defendants outside the big cities. In the eyes of the liberals running the empire, this was simply wrong. So Ilbert drafted a bill to do away with it. Under his bill, Indian magistrates would now be able to sit in judgment on whites. Justice would become colourblind.
To the expat community, the Ilbert Bill was an intolerable assault on their privileged status. The reaction was so violent that people spoke of a white mutiny, as opposed to the Indian Mutiny of 1857. It all began here, at Calcutta's town hall. Within just a few weeks of the bill's publication, thousands of irate Britons gathered inside to hear a series of inflammatory speeches against the native civil servant, the despised Bengali babu.
These men are not fit to rule over us. They cannot judge us, and we will not be judged by them. Men, they cry out for power to sit in judgment on and condemn the lion.
Truly and verily, the jackass kicketh at the lion.
Across the street in Government House, Ilbert and his colleagues were taken aback by the reaction. But rather than meet the white backlash head-on, they simply headed for the hills. After all, it was time for the Viceroy's annual retreat to Simla, far from the bully boy businessmen of Calcutta.
Here at Chapsley, his elegant house in Simla, Courtney Ilbert sat out the summer, desperately hoping the row over his bill would go away. A rather timid little lawyer who'd been parachuted into India from Balliol College, Oxford, Ilbert had completely misread the mood of the men in the plains.
As to the kind and amount of feeling which the bill was likely to excite, I had no knowledge of my own, and certainly did not anticipate such a storm. I am intensely sorry that the measure should have disclosed and intensified racial animosities.
It was a perfect illustration of the perils of ruling a continent from a mountaintop. All Ilbert had done was exchange an ivory tower in Oxford for one in Simla.
Across the country in the baking heat of the Indian summer, the agitation spread. Committees were formed, money was raised, as non-official British India mobilised. In Cawnpore, the incandescent mill owner Hugh Maxwell joined the chorus as it approached its crescendo.
The native mind is unfit to appreciate and sympathise with European ideas of administering the government of a country and people.
This white mutiny was intimately bound up with the original Indian mutiny 25 years before. Here in Cawnpore, every white woman had been slaughtered, and a legend had sprung up, not just of murder, but of rape, as if every Indian man just waited the opportunity to get his hands on a memsahib. In the same vein, the anti-Ilbert campaign had a recurrent theme, the threat posed by Indian magistrates to white women. Somehow the Ilbert Bill threatened to knock down the walls not just of the cantonment, but of the bungalow bedroom. 150,000 white people who claimed to rule over 300 million brown people regarded equality before the law as the high road to interracial rape.
Fancy, I ask you Britishers, her being taken before a half-clad native to be tried and perhaps convicted. What would please our fellow subjects more than to bully and disgrace a wretched European woman?
The higher her husband's station and the greater respectability, the greater the delight of her torturer.
All these fears, political, racial and sexual, simmered together through the summer. When the government finally returned to Calcutta that December, the city was at boiling point. Outside Government House, the Viceroy was booed. There was even talk of kidnapping him. This was the crossroads for British India. Should it be governed as Ilbert and the Liberals believed, without regard to colour? Or should it, as Maxwell and the expats insisted, be a racially segregated society? Petrified by the scale and ferocity of the White Mutiny, the Liberals caved in.
the Ilbert Bill was emasculated, giving British defendants the right to be tried by a white jury rather than an Indian magistrate. Yet this cop-out was profoundly dangerous for the future of the Raj. To Indian magistrates and their friends, the contempt with which they were regarded by the majority of expatriates was now out in the open. Another really important consequence of the Ilbert Bill became apparent. Not so much the White Mutiny as the Indian reaction to it.
The Ilbert Bill had united educated Indians of all regions and religions to produce for the first time a genuine national movement. It was the beginning of the end for the alliance between British Mandarins and the English-speaking Indian elite.
Just 2 years after the White Mutiny, the Indian National Congress was founded. It was to be the crucible of Indian independence. And from the outset, it attracted stalwarts of that educated class that served the British Raj.
Men like Janakinath Bose and another Indian lawyer by the name of Motilal Nehru. Nehru's son would be the first Prime Minister of an independent India. Bose's would lead an Indian army against the British in the Second World War.
India was the foundation of Britain's worldwide empire. If the British alienated the Anglicised elite, that foundation would begin to crumble.
But could another section of Indian society be found to prop up the British Raj? Bizarrely, the alternative to Asian apartheid seemed to lie in the social system the British understood best, their own. For many British officials in India, toiling for years on end in a far-flung land, the thought of home provided consolation in the heat of the plains. But as the Victorian era drew to a close, confusions began to creep in about both home and India. Expats dreamt nostalgically of an unchanging rural England, of squires and parsons and deferential villagers. It was an essentially Tory vision of a traditional hierarchical society ruled by landed aristocrats in a spirit of benign paternalism. The fact that Britain was in reality an industrial giant where most of the population lived in cities was somehow forgotten. People back in Britain had an equally unrealistic view of India. Queen Victoria was delighted when Parliament bestowed on her the title of Empress of India in 1877, but she never actually went near the place. What Victoria preferred was for India to come to her. In later years, her favourite servant was an Indian named Abdul Karim. He came here to Osborne in 1887 as the personification of the Queen's imagined India: courteous, deferential, obedient, faithful. Towards the end of her life, Queen Victoria added a new wing to Osborne House, which she decorated in a riot of Indian style. It looks like something straight out of the Red Fort at Delhi.
But again, it's a backward-looking vision, giving no hint of the new India the British were building, of cotton mills, of railways. It's a fantasy. What would happen if that fantasy collided with the reality?
In 1898, a new Viceroy of India was appointed. His was neither a liberal nor a racist vision. It was one based on ineffable, crashing snobbery.
My name is George Nathaniel Curzon. I'm a most superior person. My cheek is pink, my hair is sleek. I dine at Blenheim once a week.
When he took up his post at the Viceroy's palace in Calcutta, Curzon wasn't yet 40, but it was a job for which he'd long felt himself to be predestined. Small wonder, a century before, the Viceregal Palace had been designed as an exact copy of the Curzons' ancestral pile in Derbyshire.
To a Tory aristocrat like Curzon, Indian society could never be as simple as black and white.
raised to think of himself as close to the pinnacle of a pyramid of social status extending downwards from the monarch, Curzon thirsted after social hierarchy. He and those like him dreamt of replicating in the empire what they most liked about England's feudal past. A previous generation of British rulers had immersed themselves in Indian culture to become true Orientalists, but Curzon was what you might call a Torientalist.
Curzon despised liberal mandarins like Courtney Ilbert, but he despised the expatriate bigots like Hugh Maxwell even more. They might be white, but they were also lamentably common. Curzon preferred the company of his fellow aristocrats. And if they were posh enough, he didn't care that their skin was brown rather than white. In fact, about a third of the subcontinent was made up of princely states, where traditional Maharajas remained nominally in charge. These were the people Curzon felt should help him rule India.
I have always been an ardent well-wisher of the native princes, but I believe in them not as relics, but as rulers, not as puppets, but as living factors in the administration. I want them to share the responsibilities as well as the glories of British rule.
The high point of Curzon's rule was a spectacular display of pomp and ceremony which he personally staged to mark the accession of Edward VII, the Delhi Durbar.
The howdahs rocked, and one just carried away the impression of black-bearded kings who swayed to and fro with each movement of their gigantic steeds.
It was the perfect expression of Curzon's theme park, pseudo-feudal view of India. But in putting his money on the Maharajas, Curzon was forgetting who really mattered in India.
The true foundation of British rule wasn't the Maharajas on their elephants. It was the anglicised lawyers and civil servants Macaulay had called into being. The Maharajas belonged to the past. The future lay with India's urban elites. The trouble was, they were just the people that Curzon regarded as a threat.
Just 2 years after the Durbar, Curzon deliberately attacked the urban-educated Indians. He announced that Bengal, the very heartland of the emerging nationalist movement, would be partitioned. The decision unleashed the worst political violence since the mutiny. At first, the authorities assumed it was the work of hooligans. But this was modern terrorism, nationalism plus nitroglycerine, and the ringleaders were anything but poor coolies. One of them, Aurobindo Ghosh, had been head boy at St Paul's School in London and a scholar at King's College, Cambridge. He'd even passed the ICS exam, only to be rejected by the service for missing the horse riding test. The British had produced a Frankenstein's monster, Anglicised Indians, who wanted to get rid of the British themselves. Ghosh was one of more than 20 young men tried for terrorism in this courthouse at Alipore.
Yet the Alipore case was revealingly different from the Morant Bay trials more than 40 years before. Instead of the summary justice meted out then, the trial lasted more than 30 weeks, and in the end Aurobindo Ghosh was acquitted. Even the two ringleaders' death sentences were never carried out. And in a final, humiliating climb down, the partition of Bengal was finally revoked.
Instead, the British decided to move their capital to Delhi, the ancient seat of the Mughal emperors. Unlike commercial, contrary Calcutta, this would be a capital altogether more suitable for a Toriental viceroy. New Delhi is the British Empire's one aesthetic masterpiece, the ultimate facade of a supremely self-assured power. The architects crowned their creation with an inscription on the walls of the Secretariat that must be the most condescending in the entire history of the empire.
Liberty does not descend to a people. A people must raise themselves to liberty. It is a blessing that must be earned before it can be enjoyed.
Not Curzon's words, but in their tone distinctly Curzon-esque. These government buildings in New Delhi were a breathtaking bid to match the architectural achievements of the Mughals. But who paid for them? The answer was the Indian taxpayer. Clearly, until they had earned their liberty, the Indians would have to carry on paying for the privilege of being ruled by the British. And even Curzon himself admitted, British rule may be good for us, but is neither equally nor altogether good for them.
By now, the British had governed India for more than 100 years. Yet the average Indian was scarcely a penny richer. Indian nationalists complained that the wealth of their country was being drained into the pockets of the British. But what they were really objecting to was the fact that it wasn't draining into their pockets, which it would if they ruled India.
The reality was that Indian nationalism was fueled not by the impoverishment of the many, but by the exclusion of the privileged few. In the age of Macaulay, the British had called into being an English-educated elite on whom their rule came to depend. In the age of Curzon, these people were dropped in favour of decorative but largely defunct Maharajas. The result was that by the twilight years of the Empress Queen's reign, British rule in India resembled one of those palaces Curzon so adored. Outside, it looked simply splendid. But downstairs, the servants were busy turning the floorboards into firewood.
Far cold our navies melt away, on Dunan headlands sinks the fire. Lo, all our pomp of yesterday is one with Nineveh and Tyre. Judge of the nations, spare us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget.
Well, Kipling wrote those foreboding but clear-sighted words in 1897 to mark Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. And sure enough, like the proud citadels of Nineveh and Tyre, most of Curzon's works in India haven't endured. I think this disused, forgotten backyard in Lucknow, full of imperial icons, perfectly symbolises the transience of what he was trying to achieve.
In truth, by the turn of the century, India was no longer the be-all and end-all of British power. Elsewhere in the empire, a new generation had come of age. Men who were convinced that if the empire was to survive, it had to expand in new directions.
As far as they were concerned, it was quite simple. The empire had to drop the pomp and get back to its roots, to penetrate new markets, to settle new colonies, and if necessary, to wage new wars.